that is a shell mound. So today we're looking at Paleolithic and Mesolithic shell mounds and something to do with their food. It's gone down really well, and there's lots of really interesting things about it. But what could that shell mound tell you? And I want something different. Mary?
They ate a lot of seafood.
Right, okay. Let's have something else, Pat.
They were tidy and put it all in a pile.
That's one I've never come across. Bill?
The water level has risen since those times, and that was dry land at one time. You wouldn't normally throw shells into water in the throw, just throw them into the back window of the round house or whatever.
Right, okay, that's another weird interpretation. Glenda? And George?
Yes, isn't that true?
Well, I see the shape of a horse on there.
Yeah.
It's just reading a teacup, I suppose.
Yeah.
Right, these are some of the most bizarrest. Basically, one intriguing thing about these shell mounds is that they're not just about people eating. We're going to start really with when you look at the archaeological site at Scarabray. The interpretation signs at Scarabray tell you that 5,500 years ago, before they'd built the houses at Scarabray on Orkney Isles, there was a large shell mound, and they decided to dig out the shell mound and put their houses there. However, and the interpretation is that people ate a lot of limpets. You know, get lots of different mounds out of lots of different shells. But the interpretation might be that they built the houses first, they collected the shells off the beach, cladded them around the buildings, and that's how you got the shell mound. And that means that they weren't eating the limpets in the first place. Glenda?
Sorry, Cont, because I've never heard of that. How big are these then?
Basically, there was this one archaeologist, right, excavating a shell mound in Scotland, right, after he'd counted 1 million limpets, and he still had a hell of a lot of the mound to go through. Then he realised that these are huge things. There's literally hundreds of millions of pieces of shell in these individual mounds. If I'm going to throw this at you, this is really odd. In America, they found shell mounds in places like New England and on the sort of eastern coast of the United States. And as they were looking at these shell mounds, they were excavating them, and they found lots of evidence of pottery, flint, well, obsidian, not flint, and they found evidence of bone and so on, mixed in amongst the shell. And they immediately presumed that these are very early prehistoric mounds created by some of the early settlers of North America, and obviously some of the later Native Americans in North America. But as they started going through the mound, they realised that underneath the mound there was pottery dating from the 1600s. So that means that the mound had been moved from somewhere else and placed over here in the 1600s. And in the 1600s, we've got the new fathers going over to America to found the new colonies and all the rest of it. And what the interpretation is you would plant a fruit tree, and around the outside you put all these shells and all the other material, which would help against the elements and would also help towards giving some nutrients and phosphates and obviously some calcium to the growing plants. And that was actually the real interpretation. So whenever you see a mound like this, it doesn't necessarily mean to say that the mound was always at that spot, because this material can be very useful. And just because you see these mounds, it doesn't mean to say somebody sat there of a day shelling out the mollusk shells, just tossing them on the ground. They might be for another load of different reasons, which we'll come on to. So one place that we're going to look at towards the end today is a place on the South Hebridean Islands, down by here, known as Colonsay Island, a place called Loch Coig. And Knockcoig is a really interesting site because they've got loads of mounds there. And the information about these mounds tells us a great deal. But when I'm researching these classes, I often come across weird things. And I've got a weird area of Britain. Devon, North Devonshire coast around Bidford, that they've also found some of these mounds. But we only get to the information about the mound at the end of the little bit of information. And they actually found a submerged woodland forest there. And another piece of evidence, which I didn't mention before, which was quite obvious, but for some strange reason I probably put it at the back of my mind and lost it somewhere. We talk about coastal erosion, and we talk about raising sea levels, and we talk about land being eroded away. Fair enough. But 125,000 years ago, you could be standing on the coastline, and behind you is the sea. You might be looking inland, and you might be looking at a ridge, which would be the original cliff line. Because 125,000 years ago, where you're standing, the water level was much higher. And in fact, the cliff line was over there. And that's the evidence that we get from this place that we're going to look at in Devon. So in other words, you do have times in the past where the sea inundated the landscape and the cliff lines were much further inland, which is a really interesting thing. So we're not always talking about erosion. There are lots of different things going on out there. This is the site called Knockcoig. And this information about the site Knockcoig tells us that sometime in the Mesolithic period, and you've got some nice dates here of around 7,500 years ago, around those dates, you had these mounds, you have these shell mounds, and within lots of these shell mounds, you get lots of nice bits of information, important data. But one thing that we can see from these mounds is very different from what an archaeologist may have told you 10, 20 years ago. What an archaeologist may have told you 10, 20 years ago was that somebody sat here on a rock, and they had a load of limpets, and they shelled the limpets, they chucked the limpet shell there, and they put the meat in a bucket, right? And with this analogy, what archaeologists used to say, they used to take 100,000 limpets to get the same protein value as the value of a nice fattened cow. So you'd have to eat 100,000 of them to get the same protein value. And that's the presumption that they're only eating those limpets. But as you start to get into these shell mounds, you actually find other bits of evidence. You find bits of bone of other animals, bits of broken work tools, and so on. You start to understand that these mounds are a lot more than just areas where people were eating the shellfish, and also they were mounds that people lived in. So can you imagine, right? To have a mound around a settlement, you need 15 million limpet shells and cockle shells, and you've got to de-shell all these before you can put them around the settlement. So keep it insulated, right? It's not going to happen because the shells are already on the beach. You haven't done any work at all.
How do they harvest them?
Well, if different areas of Britain, right, you get build-ups of tens of millions of shells just on the beach.
Just the empty shells?
Just the empty shells.
You do in Abermarlbon, you get quite a lot there.
You do, and this is not a phenomenon which is just isolated to the Scottish Islands. This is quite widespread, and they make good fuel. They make good insulation. They're really useful for lots of things. Anyway, moving on. Finding bits of broken evidence like this, bits of bone, and so on. So we start to see this stuff mixed in. So it's really, really important. And what this is actually part of an article, and we're talking about shells, Dorothy. Dorothy, don't worry, man. Chill out.
Me shell or shell? I have your
Shells.
Did you have milk? Because Rob's not here.
We got milk, darling.
Oh.
Dorothy, just sit down and chill, man. I'm not going to have a go at you for being so late and letting everybody down, because I'm usually late anyway, so don't worry about it. So, look at this, right?
All his plugs are in. It's fine. That's still hot. Okay,
Yeah. So what you've got here, this is a shell mound for actually South Africa, and I'm gonna actually look at this article more or less straight away, and we're gonna look at this, and that'll help you understand how important these mounds are. They sound a really boring subject, but shells throughout history have been used for very many different things. And here's another little one, right? There's a metaphor, and there's a bit of an analogy, yeah. So in America, along the Mississippi Delta, archaeologists were excavating, and they were coming across shell mounds, absolutely huge shell mounds, with only one type of shell in the mounds, mussels. Not sea mussels, but freshwater mussels, right? Now in Britain, freshwater mussels used to be very populous, and in fact, we've got the likes of monks harvesting freshwater mussels. There used to be loads of them in our rivers in Britain. And I used to have a freshwater mussel in our pond, and somebody said it was about 45, 50 years old. These mussels themselves were important. When I found them along the Mississippi Delta, Louisiana Way, Mississippi, they thought, wow, Native Americans must have been sitting here eating these old mussels, eating away, and they were excavating them, and the archaeologists were only finding mussels, millions and millions of mussels, right? When it got to the lowest layer, they started finding pottery dating from the 1800s. They thought, something not quite right here, and then they went a bit further away, right? And they actually found blanks for buttons. This was part of the button making industry in the 1800s, which nearly led to the extinction of the freshwater mussels in America. And it's likely this was done on such an industrial level that the meat from the mussels would have been just chucked into the river. These stockpiles of shells were going to be used for the button making industry until they went bankrupt. Because they had cheap import. They have having cheap imports in from the various other parts of the world, even in the 1800s. So lots of things, lots of information. You can actually see that they had a bit of a varied diet, and that's the most interesting thing about this Mesolithic thing. A few weeks ago, I think it was last week, when we did the odd tools, we said about that little bone tool for prizing the limpets off the rock. Well, you've got to creep up on these little limpets, okay? And to be honest with you, prizing limpets off the rock is quite an arduous process, right? And if you're trying to get millions and millions of limpets to do something with, right, you're gonna take a long time. So you're just collecting what you've got off the beach. And lots of beaches are like this. There's actually a beach near Sully, and I can remember my children being there. I couldn't work out why my bag was full of shells because there were so many on the beach. But these things can be used for spreading on fields. They can be heated up. The said lime itself can be used for various processes, and obviously the idea of insulation. And obviously, if you can get a limpet and eat the flesh, best of bloody luck. Now this is Shakespeare Bay, North America. You can see this being eroded away, and what you must think is that these mounds also tell you that people must have been in that locality for quite some time to create these mounds for whatever they were using the shells for. So if you think of it that way, rather than eating them, it helps you understand what they're about, rather than somebody sat there day in, day out, sort of harvesting these things. We're not talking about just limpets, we're talking about cockles, we're talking about whelks. I used to love whelks. We're talking about oysters, clams, in different parts of the world, and all those types of things. Bill will be familiar with this, looking at the landscape at Sanday with me. In Sanday, you'd look at the layers, and you'd see all these different shells and little bits of pottery. This is actually from another part of the world. You can see all the little winkles and all the rest of it. So lots of this is actually human deposition, but there's going to be natural deposition as well. So you can't always think that a mound is a human deposition mound. I didn't put it on you, but I was looking at an image from Africa, and there was literally about 10, 15 meter high stacks of these, billions of shells. You've got to use that figure, billions. And it was natural, because what happens, the water itself, the tidal currents take, say, all the shells to one place. The stones are taken somewhere else, and so it can be a natural process, but when you get pottery mixed up with it, it's a human shell mound. So what we're going to do now, we're going to go to that nice little article, and we're going to say, we're going to look at me, and I think it's this one. Go up there. This is it. It was really useful, this one. Go away. The archaeological study of shell mounds. Maybe it's just a pile of shells to you, but to an archaeologist it means a great deal. And that puts that image in context from South Africa. One type of site that some archaeologists love to investigate is the shell midden, or kitchen midden, or limpet mounds, or whatever. A shell midden is a heap of whatever you want to put into it. You can have mussels, limpets, whelks, oysters, clams, whatever. You can probably find them with cold shells, but we won't go there. Obviously, but unlike other types of sites, it is the result of a clearly recognised single activity event. So it's for a purpose. Other kinds of sites, villages, farmsteads, rock shelters have their attraction, but a midden is created for one single purpose. It says there for dinner, but we now know that it's not just for dinner. It's for varying different reasons. And the article does actually come on to what I just said anyway. Shell middens are found throughout the world on coastlines, near lagoons, inland, tidal flats, major rivers, streams, wherever there's shellfish to be found. But it's not just sea shellfish, it's land shellfish as well. We forget that in our freshwater rivers in Britain. You can have a nice mussel stew. Although shell middens also date from pretty much all of prehistory, it's the period we're looking at here about 10,000 years ago. And these were really interesting times because, in fact, we've got it all wrong about the Mesolithic Paleolithic period when it comes to food. And this is why I've done it now. I left it to, because next week we're doing caves and we're going to move on a little bit. But I wanted to leave this a little bit later on because there's a completely different image. People were still essentially hunter-gatherers, but let's just take that word apart there because the answer's better. Hunter-gatherers, right? Okay. George, you go out fishing. What's that described as?
Fishing.
Yeah, but...
Oh, that could be a...
Hunter-gatherer?
Pleasure.
Yeah. But what I'm getting at, I'm aiming towards a hunter-gatherer. Like, okay, you're hunting, you're gathering fish. That's what I'm looking for, right?
It's a... fish food.
Yeah, hunter-gatherer, you're going out hunting. That's the point I wanted to make. Anyway, don't worry about that, George. It's the wrong analogy. But the point is that just because people are called hunter-gatherers, it doesn't mean to say they didn't have a home. They settled down, reducing their territories, focusing on a broader range of food and living resources. These people basically ate anything and anything they could get hold of and used it for varying different purposes. So an interesting point. The bravest man I ever saw was the first to devour an oyster raw, the oyster sort of still moving. The thing is, there are different ways of processing this stuff. In the past, you might actually boil it. You might actually eat them raw. Studying shell middens and mounds is a study that goes back over 150 years, mentioned in King Daniel's book. 150 years of archaeology, which I'm proud to have a copy of. Shell middens were first explicitly identified as archaeological in context during the 1800s in Denmark. A very esteemed archaeologist, J. Johansen Worsey, in 1843, saw that these shell mounds in Denmark were really, really important to archaeology and old archaeology. This guy, Worsey, was one of those to come up with the idea of the 3-age system, the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. And he worked in the Denmark Museum. He set up the museum in Copenhagen. This is the idea of cultural deposits. The idea of cultural deposits. They're cultural, they have a meaning, they're linked to people. Okay, they're not just natural, they're cultural deposits. And when we use the word cultural, in Denmark, those mounds immediately become scheduled, protected, ancient monuments. So in other words, you can't touch them unless you're an archaeologist with a license, because they were seen to be so important to give so much information about a very ancient period in time. I've used the word ancient in its right context. When somebody says, I was going on the internet the other day, there was a term, this ancient lawnmower from 1983. So that's the right context, ancient, it's sort of a few thousand years old. Archaeologists have studied shell middens for a number of different reasons. They made this mistake, as I've said, by working out how many shells there are in a mound, how much they ate, and how long the mound took to build up, and then the other things go in. Well, they were actually eating other things as well, you know. And actually, that mound might not have been their food, you know. So that goes on its head. Archaeology processing, with a mound like that, you can't excavate it all. You've got to be very selective. But mind you, you might miss some detail if you don't excavate it all, but you can't, because these are millions and millions of shells. Food processing, you can work out early technologies of eating food. They may have, if they were eating what was in the shells, did they steam them? Therefore, you would have heat up stones, you'd have a little vat there in the floor, put a stone in there, you might actually steam or boil them. You might bake them, you might put them in clay and you might bake them, you know, there's all that evidence there. You might have them dried like jerky, so there's loads of different ways of processing these mollusks. And also, by looking at what's in these mounds, you can work out some sense of seasonality, because some of the shellfish are more available than other times of year. You don't want to sort of eat the shellfish when they're actually spawning, for example, because if you do, there's going to be none left. Another purpose is for shell mounds, living areas, the place de resistance burial sites. This is the only note you'll see of the use of a shell mound as a burial site. And why is that interesting? Because what you might find is that somebody is buried there. There you go, that's where they're going to be buried. And what you do, you pile up shells over their corpse. Okay, so it's like a cairn. And you're not going to sit there thinking, right, mate, okay, don't rot too soon, right? We're going to 100,000 shells here in a minute. We're going to put them over you, okay? You're not going to do that. You're going to collect the shells from the beach and put them there. None of them have been eaten. Okay, maybe one or two have a bit of a feast over the body, whatever. And what the usefulness of that is that as the body rots down, the lime and all the properties of the shells themselves will aid to biological deterioration of the flesh, and it would have the properties of lime decaying or destroying any bacteria. So the shells themselves are going to be very useful in an antibacterial sense, and also the shells are going to aid in counteracting the smell of the rotting body as well. So that's why I thought that was really interesting. It's the first reference I've ever come across that. This is the point I made earlier on. Not all shells are cultural. One of my favourite shell midden articles, an archaeologist working 1984 known as Cecil described a series of weird donut-shaped shell middens consisting of prehistoric pottery and artefacts and shell located on hillsides in New England. Right? And obviously it must be that these date from thousands of years ago. You know, the mounds themselves have always been there. They haven't been moved, they've always been there. But they figured out that they were in fact evidence of early Euro-American settlement in the 1600s. We used prehistoric shell deposits, moved them over, fertilizer for apple orchards. The hole in the middle was where the apple trees stood. I was working on an excavation in Flemington a few years ago, and we were trying to find a wall, and I got everybody excavating, everything was set up, right, and we were standing coming across medieval pottery, and I thought, this ain't right, because that wall over there is part of a Tudor building from the early 1500s, and the wall continues under the lawn. So if that's dated from the 1500s, this medieval pottery is from the 1300s, then therefore the wall must have been destroyed and removed, or the pottery that we're seeing has been brought in from somewhere else. And lo and behold, the pottery had been brought in from somewhere else. The pottery from the 1300s has been brought in from somewhere else. And as we excavated through, we come across a thick layer of stone, nothing in it, and then we come across a floor of a building from the 1500s, about a metre below. So in other words, the pottery had been brought in from somewhere else to level the site.
Well, the reference to burial sites is interesting. What came to my mind straight away, when we were on Sunday, I referred to it the other night, look at the cliff face and the erosion.
Yeah.
There's a lot of shells there, a bit of million. I got a feeling you identified as human bones, didn't you?
The spinal bones from a child of about, did I say about 2 or 3 years old, yeah?
You said they were human.
Yes.
Reported it to the
Yes.
island.
Yeah, they were investigated, yeah.
Ties in with the
Yeah, so the thing is, it's not disrespectful to put the remains of a human being in a shell mound. In fact, it's quite respectful. Why is it quite respectful? Because today we think of rubbish as being rubbish. Like you know, you're not gonna, you don't put human remains out in the rubbish. You know, it's just not the thing to do. That's what we think in this society. But you've just eaten your feast, right? A member of your society, whatever age they are, has died. You think, right, we'll lay them to rest in the shell mound. Some of those shells there are some of those shells that they may have been making into something, or they may have eaten the limpet. So we'll lay them down there, and then we'll cover the body up with shells. I think that's quite respectful. We always think, when we see this in the past, it's disrespectful. I don't think it is. And they also know that there would be an antiseptic associated with the shells as well, and the lime, and that would aid in stopping any diseases spreading through the village. Job done. The oldest shell middens in the world date back to about 140,000 years ago, from South Africa. There are fairly recent shell middens in Australia as well. And the ones in Australia tell us maybe what they're doing with shells today, but maybe not the past. And this is what I mentioned, the 1900s, the shell industry was in progress along the Mississippi River. You can still find heaps of freshwater mussel shells in other areas with several holes punched out of them, lying along the bigger rivers of the American Midwest, the good old Mississippi. The industry nearly obliterated the freshwater mussel population until plastics and international trade put it out of business. Thank goodness for that.
They had well though, didn't they?
You've spotted the point we're going to come on to, right?
The price paid for those, I don't like anything from the sea, but only time they would have had high cholesterol.
What?
They would have had high cholesterol.
Yeah.
Seafood's full of shellfish is full of cholesterol.
Carbohydrates.
Cholesterol. But you see them on the menu today. It's expensive.
Yeah.
Starters.
Yeah. Well, I had a load of mussels in a pub in Arnside in Cumbria. On the menu, it was like a bowl of mussels and whatever for like £8. I thought, all right then. So I sat down. I really struggled to get through them all. It was a lovely soup, bread, and these mussels, and I was just, oh god. I was trying to get through this all. I got a modern diet, and there was only about 15 there, but I couldn't get through them all. I did get through them. No, I did get through them all, right? But you start to think, if it takes me It took me a while because I had to shell them, all the rest of it. You know, it took me a while. So you can imagine if we've got this problem now with metal tools, what were they like with tools that weren't made of metal? What I'm going to do, I'm going to digress into that weird little thing that I found. Okay, and then we're gonna go with a weird little thing that I found. And let me find it. Oh, not that. I will get there. There. It's a really weird little one. This. I typed it. I was looking at Charlemagne, right? And it's a place known as it's known as West Ho. If I get down the page, I can show you exactly where it is. It's on the south coast of well. Yeah, you were. Here you go. There it is. Did you? There it is. And there it is. So that's where we're going to go now. And that locality is interesting, just off the coast.
It had lots of sand and
Yes?
Storm Beach.
Storm Beach. And that's all useful words.
Long storm.
There it is. Job done. Near Bidford, they've got Bidford Bar there. And Bidford itself. And the weird thing about Bidford is Bidford was one of the localities in Britain that led to some of the last executions by hanging of witches in Britain. I was looking at this, it's really relevant. It may be out of context, but it's not because it ends with shells. We frequently hear about potential sea level rising in relation to the process of global warming, but it's important to recognise that changes in the sea level have gone on throughout geological history with cooler and warmer periods. And at low tide, what you can see is this. This is a landscape from the Mesolithic, Paleolithic period, 7,000–8,000 years ago, and there's tree roots and everything in here. Lovely, and it's there at low tide. During cooler periods known as ice ages, some of the water from the ocean becomes ice, as we know, and this causes sea levels to fall. During warmer times, ice gaps and glaciers melt, and the water is released back into the ocean, causing sea levels to rise again. From here, we can see two weird bits of evidence, so we're going to do that now. So here we go. I've already said this, but we'll do it again. First, stand with your back to the sea. Okay, okay, the sea's there, and look landwards to see evidence of higher sea levels. Just over half a kilometre away is a ridge, which is wooded in places. This higher ground was once the line of cliffs along this coast about 125,000 years ago, before the last ice age. You can see that it is much further inland than the coastline today. If sea levels do rise again, the coastline may return to those cliffs. Obviously not in living memory. That's a really interesting one that we've got. Where you stand on dry land there, that was underwater once, 125,000 years ago. And over there's the cliff line. Great, I like that. Second, if at low tide, you look back towards the sea and the beach, you've got evidence of lower sea levels, and look for a patch which is a dark brown, black colour, quite in contrast to the light brown with the surrounding sand. This is a deposit of peat and clay and tree roots and all that stuff that goes back to the light. Sometimes after winter storms, when sand has been scoured away by the sea, you can see the remains of wooden tree trunks, twigs and other bits of wood among the dark material, thousands and thousands of years old, when this landscape was connected to Wales. And connected, then you could walk all the way over to the continent and the island as well. These are the remains of a woodland that stood 6, 7, 8,000 years ago, preserved in the peat. And there you go, the clay, it's preserved in the clay, and along there as well, the remains of middens, rubbish dumps, shell mounds were found, which included bits of bone, seashell, and the remains of ancient flint tools. So you've got a wonderful landscape there with so much information. So what I want us to do, I want us to do some articles of the week a minute, and I want us to come back to shell mounds after the break. And we're going to first of all look at this. I love this. The reason why I love this is because down in the old London, where I actually refuse to do any acting work in London now. The last time I refused to do acting work in London, a load of people were killed, so I made the right decision. But every time I used to go down there, I used to think, I want to see the Roman remains of London. And there's only one film shoot I ever did near Kensington where I wandered off and I found a bit of Roman wall. And I wanted to find the Mithras Temple. And the Mithras Temple was found in 1954. And in 1954, when they were clearing a bomb site, they found the remains of the London Mithraeum, the temple to Mithras. And it instantly became a sensation. But they had to move it to another street. So 100 metres away, I had to move it to another street because the site that they were developing, they wanted to put up some office blocks and so on. So they moved it to another street where there was a spare plot. And they built it, they rebuilt and reconstructed it on top of a Roman bathhouse. Don't ask. So the Roman bathhouse wasn't excavated because they wanted to put the Roman Mithraeum on top of it. So anyway, they waited years and years and years. And now, when that building from the 1950s, after it was demolished, they decided, right, we're gonna put the temple back there. We're gonna re-put the Roman temple back to the original spot. And they got Bloomsburg, the book magnate, newspaper magnate, and all the rest of it, have decided that they, in their basement now, they've just opened it in the past few days, and you can actually go down 23 feet underneath this building into the basement, and you can see the Roman temple back to where it originally came from. It's a bit weird story, isn't it? But using sound lights and misty haze to bring the ruins back to life. And one of my members, Elijah Major, he said to me today, he said, I actually went there when the Mithraeum was actually in, just 100 meters away, and it looked really good then. So you can imagine going, above you, you've got all this modern technology, and going down below, seeing this temple, it's great. So it's been moved back to its original position, the Bloomsburg vast headquarters next door to the Bank of England. And there you go. Huge temple. And London is one of those weird places. You can go to Rome and see loads of Roman remains, and Tyre in France, and loads of Roman remains. You can see more Roman remains in some German towns than you can see in the whole of Britain. So it's good that this has actually gone back to its original spot. And the whole idea was that here was this weird sort of catacombs-like structure, and there was like a temple on top, and you had various corridors and stuff. And what it was, you would go down these steps into the secret bit, and it was like a dark, damp area that only men could go down into. And the site itself was probably closed, I'll give you the precise year, in the year 395, when all other religions other than Christianity were outlawed in the Roman Empire. And Kathy cynically said in Bridgend, well, the next day, not in Bridgend, in Antioch, so the next day they basically turned into a Christian church. But you all know my thoughts on Christianity. Yeah, the early stuff, great, but then it changed, and all the rest of it. But Mithraism was a religion that was dominated by men. Only men could go underneath in there. And the site is darkly lit, audio, sound, and you can hear Latin being spoken. The cult members indulged in feasting, drinking, and sacrificing. And interestingly enough, when they were excavating this building, they originally in 1954, they found the earliest piece of writing on a wooden tablet, dating I think to about AD 50, and they found the earliest piece of writing in London actually at this site as well. And so a good piece of archaeology for people to visit. The seam of damp earth helped preserve a wealth of artifacts. It doesn't show it, but they found loads of little statues and everything in the 1950s. And that from the other side. Oh my God, a woman stayed still. She's still in the same position as she was taking a photograph from the other side. She must have fallen asleep. These little objects being found, a bull, All these little knives being found there as well. At the original excavation. It's great, isn't it? And you would go a few coins, gold coins, copper coins, all this material being found. And there you go. Oh, I didn't know the wooden tablet information was on this bit. January the 8th, at 4:15 and 12 seconds, AD 57, the earliest dated handwritten document from Britain. And it's now open. Been open only a few days. You can actually go down there free. I think what it is, Bloomsburg had been very grateful for being given planning permission, and they've just basically said, well, we'll do our bit by letting people have access to this, and you can go down there. It's great. I can't imagine, 30,000 people going down there having a look at that every few days, But it'd be a good piece of archaeology, and in the Bloomsburg building as well, they've got loads of stuff displayed that they've actually found. A Latin Chapter.
Is that in the city, you say?
That's in the city itself, the Bloomsburg building by the Bank of England. And that's like a little bit of a, they found that type of carving there. So they've done a reconstruction there. And loads of different bits of evidence. Loads of stuff, they finding nails, pots, tiles. All this stuff was actually found in there. And some of this stuff is associated with the recent excavations as well in the Bloomsburg area site. So what they did, you had the original temple found in 1954, and they've excavated around that area as well. They found a lot more archaeology. So that's on display because you go in a Bloomsburg building, and in their foyer, you've got walls full of these artifacts. Walls and walls full of these artifacts. And I think this is the way to go, because you so often go to a museum and you don't know, you see a pot and you think, oh, it's found in Cowbridge, and you're in Cardiff and you're thinking, yeah, fair enough. But that shoe there was found meters away from where this display is. It's great, isn't it? So it gives you.
It's not unlike Mary Rose, because I know that's on a bigger scale. It looks like the same.
You've been to Jorvik with me as well, haven't you?
Yes.
Yes, the same there. Yeah, exactly. So I think this is the way to go. And the Mary Rose, exactly. Anyway, all these different things found there. Some of the excavations, little statues. This is related to the original excavations, I think. Little statue of Mithras, and so on.
What was he, the god of then? Secret little dark places for men.
Basically, yeah. So anyway, that's that. And then we've got what else we've got? We've also got another Roman discovery in London. A Roman sarcophagus unearthed by builders in Southwark, South London. The discovery made in London of a sarcophagi found in the original spot that it was actually placed. It hasn't been moved or whatever, because what we usually find is these sarcophagi. They've been used as horse troughs. They've been reused in burial later on. They've been used, broken up as slabs, and all sorts of different things. You can imagine you've got a sarcophagi here, little hidey hole. They've been reused, but there've been 3 found in London in recent years, in 2006 and 1999. And there's the very recent one now found, so you've got 3. These stone sarcophagi. And I can remember the one in 1999. I've got the pleasure to know Nancy Rosenberg, who, when she was excavating one of these stone sarcophagi, there was a lead coffin inside, which had a sealed lid, watertight sealed lid. Anyway, you know what you're going to see if you're going to see something like that. Everything was still putrefying and rotten inside, and remains of flowers and stuff. You don't need to do that. When they'd recorded taking photographs after they'd taken the lid, she went in there and there was a little container about sort of so big, it had a sealed lid, a little pewter container about that big, a female compact, and they got the lid off, and they turned it this way. And the cream in there, you can still see the fingerprints of the woman who had last used this lead-based cream, and it was still there. And I kid you not, you can imagine that's the, oh my God. And then she looked down at the cream, and there was some fingerprints in there. So in other words, even though the woman's flesh is rotten away, you've still got her fingerprints. It's great. So these things are really interesting things, and they've been excavating the site since January. And they found that the coffin itself had been robbed in the past. But it's unlikely it ever had a lead lining. But it's simply because it looks like it probably had a wooden coffin in there, because the lid's only just been pushed a little bit towards the side. If you want to get a lead coffin out, you need to push the lid towards the side and rip the thing out. So that's sort of unlikely. It might actually contain all the original artifacts in there. So if this was opened in the 1800s, late 1700s, or whenever it was opened, somebody looking for stone, or whatever, they may have thought, not really interested in those things, just leave it be, and it was a burial. And we know that they were looking for stone because around the sarcophagi, it looks like there was a mausoleum, a proper building over it, and all the stones have been taken. But they just decided to leave this sarcophagi there. And so here we go. This is a remarkable discovery, and I'm delighted that we're able to work and actually find this thing in the first place. So the County Council, in my long archaeological career, I've excavated many hundreds of burials, but this is the first sarcophagi, stone sarcophagi, that person has ever discovered. And what they do, they lift today, you would lift the whole sarcophagi out. Obviously, the stone itself weighing about a ton and a bit, ton and a half, contents about another ton, 2.5 tons. Then you put it into the museum or laboratory, and you'd excavate the contents in a air closed room or wherever, and you can take your time. So that's what they did. It is really a very special discovery, and here we go, image of it. Personally, I found it really fascinating to contemplate that this area was very different in the past. But there you go, there it is. You can just see the sarcophagi there, and there's a stone lid. They basically, the people who found this just moved the lid towards the side and thought, nothing in there, we'll just leave it as it is. They probably don't go around the outside to get stone from the mausoleum. It's the way they probably did it. They found this, and they moved this side. And as they're digging around here, they would have back covered this again. Forgot this was there. Job done. A couple of other articles of the week. The Great Pyramid Puzzle. 4,000-year-old corridor found. A mysterious void has been discovered in the Great Pyramid of Giza, more than 4,500 years after it was built. The cavity is about 100 foot long and lies 230 foot and 1.5 inches above ground level, leaving the scientists baffled. Its function is unknown, and they're going to send in a robot to have a look at it. It was not expected by any sort of theory, but we need to think about what it might be. And this has been found. Don't know anything. It sounded a bit vague, but oh, here we go. They believe the following. It may be a passage somewhere. The latest riddle is it leads to a hidden chamber discovered using scanning techniques to find the void. Archaeologists believe it may have been a ramp used by thousands of workmen to move 80-ton stone slabs carved out of the rock using flint tools. But there is a smaller chance that the mysterious void may be a decoy burial chamber built to deter looters. Or it may once have contained jewels and statues buried with a fairy to take with him to the afterlife. And I think that's great that they've said that, because there's no jewels there. He obviously took them to the afterlife with him, didn't they? That's obvious. That's why they're not there. Anyway, so there are all these different things that they're actually finding in Egypt still, and fascinating stuff indeed. So we're going to take a break there, and then we'll come back after the break. We'll look at Dorothy taking her clothes off. Let's take a break. No questions? Good. It's so quiet without Anne in the room, isn't it? Do you know, she phoned earlier on, Dorothy, and she just wouldn't shut up. I was like this going, yeah. So Stone Age hunters like their carbs. Analysis of settlements from the Paleolithic, not the Paleolithic period, Mesolithic period, reveal that hunters were healthy and would gladly eat anything they could get their hands on. including a diet full of carbohydrates as well, which contrasts to the image that we have of people in the past from the Paleolithic, Mesolithic period. We always think the people from the Paleolithic, Mesolithic period, about 8,000 years ago, were people that just went out, clubbed to death a few wandering through their landscape mammoths, ate a few fish, and they all died by the age of 20. Well, all those images are completely wrong. We know that they actually had settlements, and the idea of a hunter with a settlement, they would have gained a large amount of protein from the fish they ate, and the lean meat, herbs, coarse vegetables, and various other materials and foodstuffs that they would actually find. The modern version of the Stone Age diet excludes foods rich in carbohydrates. This exclusion of carbs is based on the idea that Stone Age hunters would have had no access to carbohydrates, but we know that they did. It is true that people from the Mesolithic period, 8,000, 10,000 years ago, hunter and gatherers didn't eat carbohydrates at all, but we now know that they did. There's been lots of research on this, and they munched away at their carbs when the opportunity presented itself. Carbohydrates have been a part of their diet in the past, as it is today. Landscapes that we see across Doggerland, flooded landscapes, even as far as places like the Black Sea, we find that they had a very, very rich diet 10, 12,000 years ago. And we see from these settlements which are now flooded at Doggerland, we see traces, very delicate traces of roots and seeds from various aquatic plants and wild grasses that they would have undoubtedly have eaten. Carbohydrates have been part of their diet. The modern version of our ancestors is that they wouldn't have had access to milk, but we know that they did. There would have been the ability to milk any animal, from a goat through to a cow, a pig, and a sheep. No, I don't think you would have milked a chicken. Easily digestible food with high energy content is a welcome feature if you have to make the effort of finding the next meal yourself. And traces of foods containing carbohydrates have been found across these old settlements. One thing you've got to remark is something that people usually get wrong about Paleolithic and Mesolithic people. And what they usually get wrong, is that the only food... Hang on. Say it again. Thank you. One thing we usually get wrong is that we always presume that they were only living for their next meal. We always presume that they would have had no access to berries, and we always presume that they would have had no access to preserved meats and so on. We now know that they did. Archaeologists find, as I sneeze again, I love goats.
He's allergic to shells. Shellfish.
God, on Michelle. What archaeologists find in their excavations is dependent on both the preservation conditions and how the people had prepared their food. For us, the conditions are particularly good in flooded settlements, Doggerland, near Denmark, landscapes across Denmark as well, which really preserve the archaeology well from as far back as the Mesolithic period and beyond. Organic material is well preserved, and you can also find evidence of what they may have eaten by looking at their well-preserved fires, their hearths, which you can also see on mainland sites. We don't just go to Doggerland to find this evidence of the smaller things that we're eating. You also go to sites such as Starch, which dates back to about 11,500 years ago, and you also go to places like Hoyk, where we know that they ate hazelnuts. Now, the one thing that we can say about them eating things like hazelnuts and going out fishing and eating wild grasses and so on, is that they must have realized if you concentrate hazel trees in one spot, you will get better nuts next year and less disease, and your nuts will be far better. That's referred to as farming. And we know that places like Hoyk, they actually did go out having hazelnut groves deliberately planted. We know that lots of things out there tell us a great deal more about the past than we could have ever realized a few years ago. They found seeds of wild grasses, root vegetables, and I think one important thing is that we always think of our ancestors very different from ourselves, when in fact they were very similar to ourselves. They would have eaten things like seaweed. Don't we eat seaweed today? Lava bread, exactly. So why not eat these things in the past? In fact, their diet wasn't just shells. Shellfish. Their diets weren't just limpets. It was far more ranging than that. They didn't just have to club to death an auroch or a mammoth. They had berries, and they had various plants to eat as well. The Stone Age menu was widely different depending on the region, climate, and season. When you think about it, depending on which part of the world these people came from and lived, their diets were very different. So you can't just say that those people just ate mussels over there and those people just ate auroch over there. They probably ate all these different things. But in different parts of the world, there were different levels of plentifulness. During the course... Oh, yes, please. I think what it is, I'm allergic to Mary. Oh, don't worry, Mary.
Well, I'm not allergic to Mary.
You will still go to the meal, so you've got to...
I won't be here next week, actually. But nothing to do with that. I can't come next week.
There's a bit of a link there.
Yes.
When we say that they ate various things, they made best use of their landscape. During the course of these 9,000, 10,000 years, Denmark presented hunters with terrains ranging from frozen landscapes, similar to today's Greenland, to warm islands of temperature, microclimates, very similar to parts of southern Europe holiday locations today. And what do we mean by that? Haven't we over the past few weeks been looking at weird places like Goff's Cave and places like Starch Sources, thinking, was it always as cold as we think in the past? Or were there areas across the British landscape and European landscape where there were microclimates? So say at Goff's Cave in the valley there, 14,000 years ago, it may have been minus 20 degrees centigrade out there, but in the valley, it may have been 2 or 3 degrees centigrade because they had microclimates. And this is what we're really finding out due to the archaeological evidence we're finding as well. Starch sources that the archaeologists have so far found include acorns and sea beet. Sea beet itself being the ancestor of beetroot and sugar beet. Paleolithic and Mesolithic diets included lots of proteins, less fat and fewer, but carbohydrates nonetheless. A healthy diet was important to Paleolithic and Mesolithic hunters, as it is to modern human beings today. But since we can't just send somebody from the past to today to find out what they were exactly like, we've got to look at what they left behind, what plants remains they've left behind, what shells they've left behind, what bones they've left behind. And it's in the teeth and bones of actually our human ancestors themselves that you can actually tell that their diet was rather excellent. And in fact, these wonderful hunters had good dental charts. In fact, their dental health was excellent. And you'd think that they would be losing their teeth all the time, but those skulls that we have found from this period show very little evidence of any tooth loss at all.
No sugar.
Very little sugar. And also using their teeth like tools. You can imagine that they're consuming materials that are naturally washing their teeth and keeping their teeth and digestive system clear. It's understandable because they didn't consume many sugary carbohydrates. The only sweet food available at the time was honey. And if that was watered down to create something like mead, we've got evidence of early alcoholic beverages. I remember doing an article ages ago with you guys. But you can imagine it's not going to be neat sugar on your teeth. The advantage with the starch sources, root vegetables, is that this coarse food actually helped clean the teeth. It's one interesting thing there. They had a good mastication system, a good chewing system. Even though their teeth were worn, they showed no signs that they had any abscesses, and they didn't show any signs that they had any serious tooth decay. They were worn, but worn teeth is a sign of a good diet, a coarse diet nonetheless. Today, many of us have got fillings. They didn't have fillings. And the problems with their teeth started to emerge, say about 6,000 years ago. Probably because of these sugary carbohydrates. Probably more forms of sugar start to come into their diet. Who knows? From the bones of our ancient ancestors, we see that the general health condition of them wasn't all that bad. Their life expectancy was shorter than a modern human being, but there may be a reason for that. Take this. If all of us had the ability to live forever, most of us would be dead by the age of 400. It's estimated. And the reason why is quite simple. You can't stop somebody having a car accident. You can't stop somebody going up in a plane with a plane being shot down by ISIS. You can't stop being drowned at sea. You can't stop somebody knocking you down on a traffic island or something. In other words, you would eventually die anyway. And our ancestors had more problems. Even though they weren't going to be knocked down by a train or a car, even though their health was really good, there were more perils than today. If somebody had an abscess and it becomes septic, they're dead. Today, if you have an abscess, you treat it and you survive. That's the big difference. There are only a few signs of disease on their bones, but that could be down to the fact that they only lived into their 30s or 40s. But when people do a level of life expectancy in the past, what they always do, they always look at child mortality, put that into the figures, and the average actually comes right down. There are instances of human remains from that period of people going into their 50s and their 60s. Bone quality was generally better than today. Weird. But the question whether that's due to diet or exercise is unknown. Both factors have probably played a part, but the level of physical activity in particular makes a difference. It may be an evolutionary feature because further we go back, the stronger the bones. And it's all to do with a different diet. Most of us have eaten sugar today, thanks to those damn little Welsh cakes, which are delightful, but they're full of sugar. Okay, don't feel guilty, Dorothy.
Not a bit dry today.
Right, then, fair enough.
There's a jam on them.
But you're all sat here listening to me today, and they wouldn't have been able to sit there listening to people talk about anything. They'd have constantly been on the go, maybe eaten on the go as well. They were constantly busy, and that sense of busyness keeps them fit. Michelle absolutely hates me sometimes. She says, a typical woman, I'm putting on loads of weight, she says. I don't do as much exercise as you, me. Because, I go out delivering leaflets and all the rest of it. You know how it is, Glenda, delivering all those leaflets and stuff. Keep myself active and busy. That's what they would have done in the past. Keeping yourself active and busy. Calcium is crucial to the quality and strength of our bones. Today, we are advised to drink milk because of its high calcium content. Milk would have been available to our ancestors, but not to the degree that we can actually make cups of tea just like that, you know. Calcium is found in many other foods, shellfish for example. So I think they would have got their calcium from that as well. They had strong bones and strong teeth. They lived active lives and ate a coarse diet consisting of anything edible that they could get their hands on. Haven't finished yet. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to put the light on. We're going to do a little bit more, and then we're going to call it a day. So there you go. Let's turn that off. I'm not talking to Bill anymore.
You are.
Sorry, Bill. That, see what I did there? Perfect. Some last interesting bits and pieces. Now, these people in the past, sort of an overview, they didn't just subsist on the landscape. They did more than surviving. They didn't just survive on the edge. We're here today. We're the result of our ancestors. If they were struggling all the time, then we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have technology. We wouldn't have got to the moon if we ever did, but we certainly wouldn't be flying planes. Because diet is really important in the past. When you've got small numbers of people, you really need a good diet. For the most part, the general picture of life used to be that they were very nomadic, foraging for what they could find off the landscape, but that's really not the case. That little place I showed you at the beginning, Oronze, Colonze, and the Hebridean Islands, are finding middens and rubbish mounds full of wonderful bits of archaeological information. Not just shells, but bones of land animals and bones of fish from way out at sea. Some people used to say that you don't find fish bones on lots of archaeological sites along the coast because, you know, fish bones really don't survive. But Bill and I have been to a site in Scotland and fish bones surviving from about 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, and you can just see them all there amongst all the shells. Some people didn't eat fish in the past because they associated fish with the scavengers of human flesh out at sea. And lots of people didn't eat fish along this coastline because the ships that they just deliberately wrecked, the victims out at sea would be gnawed upon by fish, and they didn't wish to eat those fish. That might be a reason. Ooh. In the mounds themselves, you see non-marine species. Amongst these species are the bones and antler of deer. For the most part, these coastal middens are full of shellfish, various limpets and periwinkles. Why are they so important? They're so important because there's lots of reasons why they're there. For food, for bait, catch fish and get land animals into snares. Raw material for tools, spreading on the field, utensil manufacture, ornamentation, and currency. Archaeologists look at these mounds and now they really stand to understand what they're about. Other midden sites in the southwest, as we mentioned, at West Hoe, radiocarbon dated to about 7,000 or 8,000 years ago. That site that we saw is fascinating beyond the images I actually showed you. And I showed you those images of the site in down in Devon. And one interesting thing about it, when they started excavating it, they started finding some strange things amongst the limpet shells. They started to find land snails amongst the limpet shells. And they actually started to find plant and insect remains of animals that lived in woodlands. And then they suddenly realized that people were bringing these shells from the coast inland into a middle of a wood, because all those little creatures found amongst the limpet shells and the other shells found there are land animals. So whatever they're doing with these shells, they're doing them within a wood. So we've got that very interesting thing. We can tell lots from these mounds. And then they started looking through that mound that we saw down at Bidford. The proper name is Westwood Hoe. They started finding cattle, pig, red deer, roe deer, and obviously fish remains. So they had a very, very rich diet. And this is the course of things that archaeologists are actually starting to see. In Scotland, when they were looking in some of the mounds, they started to find some very strange things indeed. You know, I was talking about human remains being found in the mounds as being Bill mentioned. That's without doubt. But they actually started to find the articulated remains, complete remains, are the remains of large otters in these mounds, just laid out. And archaeologists thought, this is a bit strange. And then the realization that they may have been deliberately buried there because our ancestors respected the otter, or they simply took the animal's pelt off it and the animal was killed and just left there. We don't really know. Or they may have been pets. And our ancestors having pets? No. They would have had dogs and all sorts of things. Oh, yes. Bingo. Yes. On dry land, our Mesolithic forebears hunted a range of both animals and birds, larger animals like the auroch, and large deer and elk. It is very large prey that used to give the idea that they used to always eat big pieces of meat and then not eat anything else. And when they got really desperate, they just used to eat shellfish. But they used to eat everything, actually. And some of that meat that they're hunting was actually dried or smoked. We're starting to get evidence for that now. Smaller animals such as smaller otters, because the big ones we're talking about earlier on, you got smaller otters, pine marten and badger were probably caught using snares because they were much more difficult to shoot with a bow and arrow. Birds too were probably on the menu as their feathers were used for arrows at the very least. And we know that some of these birds were used in burial rites. That site in the Low Country on the continent where they found these wonderful remains of swan's wings, with a lady lying in amongst these swans' wings and the child in her arms. So, you know, animal bones are used in burial rites as well. Unlike the remains of animals, evidence of various plants is difficult to find, but we do actually find them. A range of plant material recovered from recent excavations not only tell us that they were eating hazelnuts, they were eating various types of wild berries, celandine, for example, dogwood nuts. They were even eating water lily. Water lily seeds have been found, and grasses and sedges and the seeds associated with them. There has also been some evidence of grinding, so they would have ground some of those seeds down, and also ground some of the dried hazelnuts down as well. How these foods were cooked is more difficult to answer, but as I've mentioned before, what we do find is that we get pot boilers, stones that are heated in a fire, and they're placed in a hole in the ground that's lined. The water's heated up, and then anything you add to it is boiled. So all these bits of wonderful bits of archaeological evidence are things that we can find looking at shell mounds and try to really understand what our ancestors were eating. They were as healthy as us, good bone structure, better teeth than us, and probably a much more superior diet because there were a lot more things around back then that were naturally occurring than they are today. So are there any questions?
Obviously, if it would have partly goes far back, what's the original pottery? Is it Mesolithic?
About 7,000 years ago. So getting into the Mesolithic, Neolithic, yeah.
I'm just thinking about utensils and that.
Yeah. But, well, as you know, you've seen whalebone ribs being used as a plate and a lantern and all these things. So all these things can be used. Yeah. Any other questions?
It's not a question, it's nothing really to do with it, but my gran used to have a swan's wing to clean the grate.
Oh, yes.
Like a brush.
Really?
Yeah.
I've seen that. Portrayed on television.
Yes. She blacklighted the grate, like, and then there was always a swan's wing, but she done it in the morning, the ashes, and brushed with the swan's wing.
That's so bizarre. I hope they asked the Queen. Any other questions? Probably the Queen prosecuted them, you know.
It's a very interesting type, I think.
Yeah.
He
It is. It is. It is. Shame we can't do more, but I've got next week. We're looking at caves and stuff. A bit more about that, but different from what we've done. So, okay. Hopefully, see you all next week if there's no more questions. Thank you very much, and hopefully, yeah, I might just come in by train next week, so at least I'll be early. Anyway, thank you very much. I hope you understand. I'm going to get this.
Today?
I was on time. I was here before everybody else. Hang on, I was here after George, wasn't I, George? But George, didn't I get here about 10 to? Yes, you did. See? Anyway, thank you very much, folks. See you all next week. Thank you. But Mary's quite contrary.